people have been talking about it for quite a long time, and I think it is one of those things I think for the last 5, 10, 15 years is people have been working out what it actually means. And things like processes, industry bodies, ways of measuring net zero, and also some government legislation around it have sort of been being evolved and catching up with what the long-term aim is as well. So we're in that position now where if you look at the UK, it has a legally defined net zero target by 2050 as a country. And clearly real estate's a big part of that, with roughly 40% of emissions coming from real estate and real estate related activities. So I think the first thing to say is it's going to be a long journey. And while we've got that 2050 target in the UK, what a lot of organisations have done, not just in real estate, but occupiers and operating businesses, have set their own targets a little bit sooner than that, often sort of at the 2030 or 2040 threshold as well. So I think we're at that point now where people understand the scale of the challenge now, and I think have probably had 5, 10 years of starting to measure and codify where we are, as well as there has been a sort of long-term look to address about just emissions generally across the UK. And in some areas, some really positive stories there already in terms of the way we generate power and some of the usage already starting to come down. But I think there's certainly 6 years of hard work to 2030 and 16 years of hard work to 2040 to really start making a dent and start getting onto the pathway which everyone talks about that we need to do that. But there's a lot of built real estate in the UK, and while you can do things perhaps quicker when you're delivering newer buildings as well, there's also a legacy existing stock to work on as well. And so I think when we talk about that net zero journey, yeah, we've made some great progress. There are some high level general things where emissions have started to come down, much more use of renewables that then come in, and start of this systems thinking that you need to be able to hit net zero. But there's a lot of work to do in terms of improving fabric in buildings and then look longer term as well.
I think there's a combination of carrot and stick on this. So you have the legislation which the government have released and also just slackened. But individuals are seeing and companies are seeing that it's their responsibility to act. And there are a lot of corporates releasing their net zero strategies, whether that's 2030, 2040, or with the government at 2050. So there's a combination of legislation and corporates having their own responsibility in their makeup and the foundations of their own businesses as well.
I think the other big thing is values as well. So what we've started to see, and I think people sort of forecasted at some point this would happen, is that actually when people look through into long-term value, and people that want to own assets, they want assets that meet modern standards. And that is a big driver. And I think the biggest progress is always where there is a social aim and an aim that government policy is championing, but it's coupled with a commercial driver to do it as well. And what we've started to see is buildings that have low operating costs, generally because they use not much energy, are more attractive to tenants. And for asset owners longer term as well, they look at that and think, look, I'm not going to have to spend a lot of money down the line in order to do that. And we start to see that benefit, both in terms of values, the lease up rates of buildings that are more efficient as well. And I think all of that sort of helps move things forward. And even the RICS, its guidance around Red Book as well, valuations, is you start to see that environmental and energy usage angle come in much, much more than it will do. And I think that will continue now. And all of the asset owners are starting to see that bifurcation with those buildings that are close to net zero or able to achieve it, actually looking more attractive longer term.
We look at sustainability across kind of two different lenses. The first one is kind of a specific strategy lens. So if we take our equity strategies, they are focusing on both the operational and the embodied carbon, focusing on doing the right things there. And then we kind of look out across Octopus Real Estate and look at the strategies and ensure that all of them are planned to hit our net zero goals. and also to incorporate regulations and work with those regulatory bodies as well to ensure that everything is lined up and we can communicate that strategy well to the market. So going into more detail on the strategy level, looking at the equity side, so we have strategies such as the care homes team that are very much looking at owning assets for the long term. And as we pointed out, those long-term strategies mean that we are really building for 4 years to come. So it means that we are, funding these buildings in order to make them electric at when they PC, and also ensure that they have renewables as well. And working with those tenants in order to have that relationship and that engagement to ensure that they are lasting for the future. And then when you look at the development side of that as well, we're looking at the whole life cycle of the building, ensuring that we're measuring that, collecting that data to understand what the building and the impact it's having on the environment, and then also looking at how we can educate the developers and the contractors on that and ensure that we are then pushing the market as well in order to look at the whole building and also the end life cycle part of that as well. And the way that we approach it at Octopus is that it's very much embedded within the teams. So what you could see is if someone's just having it as a siloed role, that it's not actually fundamentally part of the mandates. But the way that we see it is that each of the teams have their own responsibility and they're all wanting to make that change and that impact. So it's less of one person holding all the responsibility and more ingrained within the teams. And these mandates that we have and the strategies that we have very much have those embedded so that it's a collective in order to get to where we want to and to make that impact.
I think an interesting way is to look at also that difference between sort of equity or strategies where you're owning assets for long term and also when you're a lender. So Octopus Real Estate is an asset owner and operator and also a lender as well. And I think the contrast where you're a lender is quite interesting as well, because how do you have that impact and responsibility or influence into what is happening on those assets as well? So a lot of the lending we do is either on ground up development or what we call sort of transitional assets. So assets which might be a bit tired towards the end of their life cycle and need that work, refurbishment, regeneration to come back up to the value cycle and be attractive for occupiers. But with debt, it's traditionally been quite sterile in terms of that relationship, which is there is some lending onto an asset and the lender sort of really just looks at it through a financial lens as well. And so how do we sort of take some responsibility for that where we are funding parts of the capital needed for these buildings and take that forward? And there's a bit of that contrast with the strategies where we own assets. And what we try and do on the lending side is really look to create products which nudge behaviour a little bit as well, and also bring in some of that education as well that we've talked about. And I think we take that responsibility seriously and realise that education is a key piece. And as we talked about earlier, not every real estate company operator is big enough to have its own environmental sustainability expert as well. So what can we do? We very much see part of it is how do we share some of that knowledge? How do we create products that also help with that knowledge sharing? So a good example is the Greener Homes Alliance that we have with Homes England, McBain's and Octopus Energy, where it is 4 parties coming together. It is providing development loans to medium-sized developers who are building really environmentally friendly homes, giving them an economic incentive, so a big interest rate discount up to 150, 200 basis points. But importantly, it's the education piece of that panel of 4 people all speaking together. What can you do to make buildings closer to net zero in operation, but also through that build as well in terms of the embodied carbon in it? And if we don't have that piece of it, then we're not going to nudge that behaviour, that thinking, because people have got established ways of doing things.
The important bit is the knowledge sharing and the partnering that needs to be done across the market. If we operate in silos, then it will be a lot harder, and those targets will seem a lot further away. And what we're also seeing is embedding technology into the strategies is really going to help. For example, we are partnering with a retrofit product that will be able to be used within our brokers and our end users. And we'll be able to understand and quantify the massive problem of residential retrofit as well. The industry has learnt a lot up to this point, but there's a lot more to do in order to get to these targets. And as we've been saying, I think the partnering and collaborating and sharing of that knowledge will be really important and really ensure that we get to those targets. Within that, there are certain elements that we need to get into more of the detail, understand the data, and also just work with the governing bodies in order to have a set way of looking at buildings.
There's an awful lot of work at this, and I think The way I look at it is a lot of this has been planning, and a lot of work is first of all understanding buildings, doing building by building pathways basically for what needs to happen on existing stock as well. And there's always going to be that bit of a lag before you get there. The one benefit of having the lag is that the technology that's available then to go in and help address it actually has some more time to sort of catch up where you need to be as well. So we've seen that particularly over the last 2 or 3 years, a lot more heat pump technology and other things as well that have come in. So I think now it is the hard work. It almost feels like it's going to be that physical work on the site to actually do this on existing buildings, whereas a lot of before has been about planning and just working out really where we are.